Now it's time to get into one of my favorite things to do within Microsoft Azure, and that is to create a virtual machine. Now, if you're in the home page, there's a Create a Resource button right in the top left corner, or within this left menu bar, there's also a Create a Resource. If you click it, you're going to be taken into the Marketplace view. Now, the first item on the Get Started tab is Windows Server 2016. We can also see an Ubuntu server as the second item. If you're looking for specific images, don't worry, we can go into here and choose our favorite image. You can also go into the Compute section, look for images. For instance, this SQL Server running in a Windows Server is probably also a virtual machine image. You can search the Marketplace. So if you're looking for Windows, you can actually bring up, well, this is a lot of unrelated stuff, but you can certainly bring up all of the Microsoft published set of Windows. You can see Windows 10, Windows 7, etc. Let's go back to the Marketplace, Get Started, and choose Windows Server 2016. Now this is a wizard type view, a tabbed view within the browser. So this is tab 1, Basics. The first thing you're going to do is select your subscription. Now, if you have only one subscription, then you don't really have a choice. If you have more than one subscription, make sure you're creating this machine in the right subscription. This is where the billing goes. Now, you do need to select a resource group. You could have an existing resource group, put it into there, or you can click this Create New button and create a new resource group. Now, creating a virtual machine is going to create a number of resources, like 6 or 7 resources. And so I'm going to create a resource group, AZ New VM 104. Now, this naming doesn't have to be unique across all of Azure. It's only unique to your subscription. You have to give the virtual machine a name. So I can call this AZ New VM 4. And that will be the name of my virtual machine. Now, the next big decision is the region. Now, Microsoft does claim to have over 50 regions of the world, as each individual does not have access to all 50 because some of them are government regions or China regions, Germany, etc. So you are going to have a couple dozen choices. Now, I should point out that you might find some regions are full. So if you choose East US and you go to create a VM, perhaps they won't have one for you. And especially during 2020, when we're having this crisis, a lot of the virtual machine regions are full. So you probably want to choose maybe a South Central US, kind of an unpopular one. This also does have an impact on pricing. Now, it might be a little subtle, but if you choose an Australia region or a Japanese region or an African region, you're going to pay a little bit more than if you choose East US, etc. So, pricing is a problem for you. You may want to choose a region in the right location with the right price. Now, there is this concept of redundancy. Now, I have chosen South Central US. It does not support application availability zones. And so if I wanted to choose regular Central US, I could create availability zones. And we'll talk about availability zones in another video. This is the image that's going to get chosen. Now, at this point, we can change it. If we want 2019 Windows Server, we could change it there or go over to Red Hat or Debian and things like this. Okay, leave it as 2016. Now, one relatively new feature is this idea of a spot instance. Now, a spot instance is basically you're going to be getting a virtual machine at a lot cheaper price, but you can be evicted at any time. So really, it's sort of like flying standby on an airline. You are getting your seat cheaper, but if somebody comes along and a paying customer wants to get that seat, you're going to get booted from the plane. So if you really have low priority tasks and you don't mind getting booted and you want to save some money, then a spot instance is the way to go. Next big decision here is the VM size. And so you see it's been giving me the DS1 V2 by default, and I can actually see the pricing. I'm going to click Change Size. Now, this is a long list, 167 sizes currently in this region, Central US region. And I can filter this. So, for instance, going in here and saying I want to see machines that are between 0 and 8 gigabytes of RAM, it's going to filter it right down if I know specifically what kind of machine that I want. So we can see the features, the number of CPUs, the RAM, the amount of external disks it supports, the operating I/O per second, and most importantly, the price. And so I can get a B series VM relatively cheaply. This is $10 a month. B1MS is $27 a month. I should warn you that these one CPU machines are quite underpowered. You're going to have trouble booting them up. They're going to be slow. half a gigabyte of RAM and 1 CPU is not very powerful for a Windows server. If you're running a Linux machine, maybe you would have a little bit more luck. So I'm going to choose B2 MS. It is about $100 a month, but we are now getting 2 CPUs and 8 gigabytes of memory. I guess the M stands for memory. I could go to the B2S actually for 4 gigabytes for half the price. Again, your region, your currency might be different here. I'm going to select B2S. Now I do have to come up with an administrator username and password. This is the username that you're going to use when you log in to the machine using Windows Remote Desktop. If you were doing a Linux machine, you're going to be asked for SSH private key here. The next big decision will be which ports to open. Now, it used to be that they had no ports open and you couldn't access the machine from outside of Azure. Now they have RDP on by default. If you want to turn this into a web server, you're going to need to have web ports open. For Linux, it would be SSH, not RDP. This is a security concern anytime you have ports open, so be extra careful. If you have an existing Windows license, if you're Azure Enterprise, Microsoft Enterprise customer, then you might be able to repurpose some of your existing licenses to Azure, and you can select this. Moving to the next tab on disks, we can see here that we are getting chosen a premium solid state disk by default for the operating system. We could downgrade to a standard solid state or even a standard hard disk. This is going to change our selection of virtual machines and the pricing around that. I would leave it as premium SSD unless you really have a reason not to. Relatively new addition to the screen is the encryption. Now, all Azure VMs are encrypted on Azure Storage accounts by default. If you want to provide a customer managed key, that's done using Key Vault, and you can choose it now in the sign up screen. Data disks are the additional disks. So we have a temporary operating system disk, which would be like the C drive. And if you need additional disks, then you can create and attach data disks. And depending on the instance type you chose, there's a limit to the number of them that you can create. Now, going on to networking, we have a whole section on networking coming up, but it's going to create a virtual network by default. If we want to attach this to an existing virtual network, then we would choose that from the drop-down here, but we're going to leave all these to the defaults. Basic network security group. We already chose the ports on the Basics tab. This is just a reconfirmation. Accelerated networking is only for certain instance types that allows very high-speed connection on 2 or more machines of the same instance on the same network, but that's not qualified here. And if we're creating this VM with the intention of putting it behind a load balancer, we can make those selections right in the screen. So we do get what's called Azure Security Center Basic for free. We can upgrade to a higher level of Azure Security Center plan. We'll talk about that another time. These are all the logging and monitoring. I tend to turn these off. I'm never going to go and examine the boot diagnostics for a VM. You might want to, and maybe in a development or testing area, you're going to want to do that. But I leave all the diagnostics off at this point. We could have this running under its own system managed identity, what's called a service principal. I do like to enable the auto shutdown in development, especially. These types of things, you can start them up, leave them running, and forget about them, and you're going to end up running up a big bill. And so I could do this at, let's say, 11 p.m. Eastern time, and that will shut the VM down and will stop the cost at 11 p.m. I don't need to be notified before shutdown. We can also set up the backup here. We're going to have a whole section on backup, and so we won't touch that right now. This section is allowing you to run scripts. So if you have a startup where it's going to install some software and do some configuration, you can have the VM extension that will run scripts. If it's a Linux machine, there is a thing called Cloud Init, which is for Linux. We can run this on what's called Azure Dedicated Host, which is dedicated hardware that is kind of expensive, but instead of running as a virtual machine with other customers on the same machine, you get your own machine that you're running virtual machines on that no one else gets to share. That's a whole separate thing. Proximity placement groups. It's almost the opposite of an availability set. Availability sets on the Basics tab put machines far enough apart so that if one of them goes down, the other ones are not affected. Proximity groups are the opposite, where it's going to put the resources physically closer together in the same region. That would be if two machines need to communicate with each other and you want to get the absolute lowest amount of latency communication between them. You'd want to put them physically close together, and that is sort of the opposite of availability. This is if the region goes down or the data center goes down, you're going to get multiple servers going down. The default here is Gen 1. Generation 2 VMs are not yet supported, including encryption, so don't touch that unless you really need to. Tagging is important, so if you want to set this up as a dev box or a prod box, you can set some metadata here. On the last screen, you get to review and create the machine. It does a validation, so if it's green, you're good. If it's red, you've got an error. It's telling you the final price, so it's about 7.4 cents per hour in Canadian dollars, based on my B2S selection, and I can see all the settings that I did. Now, one of the important things that you can do here is you can look at the ARM template for this solution. Go here, get the JSON file that represents your solution, and do other things in terms of managing that. We'll cover ARM templates in this course, of course. But at this point, I'm just done. I'm going to hit the create button. And so Microsoft is going to go off. It's going to take 3 or 4 minutes. Microsoft's pretty good at creating VMs these days. They even have some on standby. So if I happen to choose the right VM type with the right disks, they're just going to grab one of their existing VMs, and I can get that within a minute or two. But even if it has to create it, it's less than 10 minutes. So let's let this run. And when we come back, we'll have a VM, hopefully.